Hello, and I want to welcome you again to our webcast on Renewal. Our heart's desire is to see your life renewed, to see your family renewed, your church renewed, your community renewed. We just want to see God come and work and meet with you and do a great and mighty thing. We've been here at the Cove, and we've had some wonderful times of interview. We've had some wonderful meetings and speakers. I have been so blessed by the people that I've got to meet. And you're going to get to meet one of those people again today. York Moore. York, welcome to our webcast.
Thanks,
and we appreciate you taking the time. I know you've been speaking, busy. You're heading out again early in the morning, so thanks for taking the time to do this. Wanted just the people to get to know you a little bit and your heart, and want to talk a little about revival, renewal. That's what our broadcast is about. But I know your testimony. I heard a little bit of it, and I think the people would be greatly blessed by your background. Give us a little of your background, who you are, and how you came to the Lord. I think it'd be real interesting.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to. I became a Christian when I was 20 years of age, studying philosophy at the University of Michigan. And what was interesting about my conversion really has a lot to do with my background. I remember when I was growing up, we had a sign in the front of my home that read, "The Moors, the Atheists." And we had a barrel on the side of our house for burning Bibles and other religious propaganda, as my parents liked to refer to it. And so I was raised in a very anti-God family. But I do remember an encounter with God at a very early age. I was 6 years old, and I was sitting in the bathtub. And I heard God. I heard God speak to me. And so I began to talk to God. And I don't know how long the conversation lasted, but I was talking with God, and my parents came in, and they said, "Who are you speaking with, Rand York?" My first name is Rand. Actually, I'm named after a philosopher named Ayn Rand, who wrote Anthem and We the Living and Fountainhead. Very, very atheistic, humanistic philosophy. She teaches that the chief value of humanity is selfishness, that we have an obligation to fulfill ourselves, even if it means hurting other people around us. So that was the kind of philosophy I was being raised in. And so here I am having this conversation with God, and they said, "Who are you speaking with, Rand York?" And I said, "Well, I'm speaking with God." And they said, "Oh, well, we thought we told you that there is no God. In fact, people who believe in God, they manufacture Him in order to help them through life, kind of like a crutch." And this is the answer that I get, and I'm all of 6 years old. And so I said, "Well, God doesn't exist?" And they said, "No, God doesn't exist." And so they left the room. And being the naive 6-year-old that I was, I had the conversation. I had to formally end it. So I looked back up at the ceiling and I said, "Well, God, my parents say you don't exist, so I have to stop speaking with you now." And that began the first day of the next 14 years of my life, living as if there were no God. And, you know, whenever we live outside of God's boundaries, things fall apart. We can't contain our family. We can't contain relationships. We can't live life the way it was intended to be lived without God in our lives. And so my family quickly disintegrated. My dad started using and selling cocaine. We left my dad. We were homeless for a while. Lived in the back of a van. We lived in the basement of a church. We finally wound up in one of the suburbs of Detroit, where I quickly kind of fell in with the wrong crowd. Drinking and sexual promiscuity at a very early age, dabbled with devil worship. I didn't really believe that there was a devil. Since there's no God, there's no devil. Right. But it was the trendy thing to do in the 1980s. But I remember waking up one day, it was at the end of my sophomore year in high school, and I thought to myself, if I don't change my life, because at that point in time I was getting drunk about 3 or 4 times a week, and I said to myself, if I don't change something in my life, then I'm going to either, wind up dead or in prison, or even worse, on drugs like my dad. That was really the epitome. I'd rather be dead than on drugs, even though I was drinking heavily. Drugs were kind of that was the end. So I made a change in the flesh, and so I decided that I was going to clean up my life. So I changed my clothes, I cut my hair, I applied myself in school, and I went from a straight D average to a straight A average. And so for the last 2 years of high school, I got all A's. And but that cumulative GPA isn't very good. It's winds up to be a C, which certainly isn't good enough for most colleges, let alone the University of Michigan, where my mom wanted me to go. My parents were both educated at the master's degree level. They were teachers. And it's a true story. My mom, when she found out I got rejected from the University of Michigan, she went to the admissions office and she begged them to let me in. And so they let me in under a probationary status. You know, if I burped in class, I was out of my ear. But I really fell in love with learning at U of M. I studied philosophy and psychology. Those were my two majors. And, studied more kind of research methodology, statistics in psychology. That was going to pay the bills. But philosophy was my main love. And I thought to myself, if there's any meaning in the universe outside of God, if there's any point to my life, I'll find it in the philosophy department. And boy, was I wrong. I read Nietzsche, and I read all of the, David Hume. I read all of these thinkers, and no one had the answers. No one made any sense to me. I understood them, but the end of their philosophy was just as pointless as Ayn Rand's. And so I remember, however, really, when the Lord started working, He was always at work in my life, but when I started recognizing His work in my life again, it was my third year at the university. I was taking a class on Nicomachean ethics, the ethics of Aristotle, and it was a small class, maybe 12 students, and there were 3 or 4 students who kept on talking about values and pro-life and divine purpose and these kinds of things. And suddenly it dawned on me, these are those weak-minded religious people that my parents warned me about. What are they doing here? How did they get into this university? And so I took it upon myself to persecute them. I wrote papers against them. I debated them. When it was my turn to lecture, I lectured against them. And I'd like to say because of their love and the soundness of their reason, their faith, they won me to Jesus, but it was just the opposite. I actually turned one of them away from Christ. So I was a very, very hate-filled, arrogant young man. And I remember the last day of that class, the assignment in the class was basically to write a philosophy statement about your life. What is your worldview? And at the conclusion of 3 years of studying philosophy at the University of Michigan, one of the greatest institutions in the U.S., my conclusion was that there is no God. When we die, we cease to exist, and therefore the purpose in life is to live for the moment, to do whatever you want, to live for pleasure. And
let's stop there and just talk about that just a few moments before we get on into how you came to know the Lord. It seems to me, and of course I did not grow up in a Christian family. I grew up secular, but I believed in God. But just even that belief in God, it gives at least some purpose. I mean, without God, if everything is material and everything exists, then when you die, that's it. And the best thing you can do is accumulate, to your best of knowledge, what pleases you materially.
That's right.